Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Oh my gosh. So a little bit of a delay there. Couldn't get the music to turn off. So anyways, I'm glad you're here. I'm happy you're with me, and I'm hoping you're having a really great day. So we're going to get started here. First of all, I wanted to show you the big picture. So we're going to be starting into chapter 4, which is the real world economic principles. And so this is the big picture. These are the real world economic principles, and they're placed into the model, and we're going to do one quadrant at a time. So that's how we'll start. I want to welcome you to this Divine Economy Theory fireside, and thank you for taking your time to be here with me. I know that your time is precious. This Facebook Live series serves as an audiobook and as an archival resource, since I am the author and originator of the Divine Economy Theory, and I am the one reading the book. This Facebook Live series is also a love story. It is a story about love of the Divine Economy Theory, the love of freedom, the love of peace and prosperity, and the love of voluntary social cooperation. Let's get started. Today's fireside is Chapter 4, Part 1, and the title of the chapter is Real World Economic Principles. This is a fascinating chapter for many reasons. It places all of the economic concepts and principles into the model, and it uses production possibilities frontiers to visually show how that concept works in the economy. Because there's many concepts and principles, I will break this chapter up into 4 episodes. Again, I'll show you the big picture. So those are all the principles we're going to cover in chapter 4, and in this audiobook we're going to cover one of those quadrants. So let's see who's here. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you can email me, and we'll go look at the Facebook Live page and look at some links that are there. So as you can see, there are links here on the bottom of that information about this Facebook Live. This first link takes you to Amazon, to More Than Laissez-Faire. The second one is a way you can get notified by email when the Facebook Live goes live. The next one is a free workbook PDF that has a diagram for each page, and then you can just make notes on that as we go through the diagrams in the book. And then the final link there is to my YouTube channel. And then there's also the email addresses. There's 2 there that you can contact me by email if you want. So now we're about to go and start on the audiobook. So that's what we'll do right now. Chapter 4, Real-World Economic Principles, the Leaves of the Divine Economy Model. Preface. One of the beauties of the whole system is its reciprocity. Part of the wholesome environment that is sought comes from the health of the system itself. Leaves not only contribute to the growth, but they also create a favorable microenvironment and eventually add nutrients back into the system, strengthening the roots. These real-world economic principles are numerous like the leaves on a tree, and their importance cannot be forgotten. Each leaf contributes in many ways to the overall health. So what we'll do now is we'll look at the highlights for that. This is Chapter 4, Real-World Economic Principles, Leaves of the Divine Economy Model. The whole system has reciprocity, and these real-world economic principles are numerous, like the leaves on a tree, and each one contributes in many ways to the overall health. So we'll now read the next paragraph. Okay, but what I wanted to show you is how this chapter unfolds. And so that's what we'll look at now. So Chapter 4, Real-World Economic Principles, the part that we're going to be looking at is the quadrant that's the human spirit order quadrant. And there's a canopy that is composed of principles. And in this quadrant, the canopy, the leaves of that canopy that we're going to be looking at is price theory, marginal utility, imperfect knowledge, profit and loss, economic calculation, prices of higher order goods, disutility of labor, and competitive theory. So that's the first part of Chapter 4 in More Than Laissez-Faire. Uh-oh. Did that not catch? Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so here we are at this first part, and it's called a canopy composed of principles. With the foundation of the conceptual divine economy model laid out, and production possibility frontiers sufficiently examined, it now becomes possible to insert economic principles into the model, fully aware of the interconnectedness of all the principles. The locus of placement of the principles in the model is arbitrary, yet it is logical. The logic of placement into the model can be deemed as a mental exercise, forcing one to examine just how interconnected the economic principles are. I take the liberty to begin the process. So we'll look at the highlights for that. So again, we're in this first section of this chapter, and it's called A Canopy Composed of Principles. And what we do then is we insert economic principles into the model, which we're fully aware of the interconnectedness of all these principles. And that locus of placement into the model is logical. And this exercise of placing them in there helps us to examine how interconnected the economic principles are, and that's what we're about to do. We're going to begin that process. So, to begin, I divide the model into quadrants, with a fundamental element on either side of each quadrant. Dividing the model into quadrants then sets the stage for examination of economic principles that have a strong tendency towards the following characteristics: human spirit order, order transformation, transformation law, law and human spirit. So here is a little bit different version of that diagram I showed you a minute ago. This doesn't have the principles in it. It just shows you the quadrants. And so diagram 4A is quadrants of the divine economy model. And now we'll look at the highlights for that. So I divide the model into quadrants with a fundamental element on each side. Okay, so here are the fundamental elements. They are human spirit, transformation, law, and order. So each quadrant has a pair of these fundamental elements. And by dividing this model into quadrants, it sets the stage so that we can look at these economic principles, and we will put those principles based on their tendency, the strong tendency that they have towards one of these fundamental, or towards two of these fundamental elements. So the first quadrant down here, this human spirit order quadrant, the two fundamental elements are human spirit and order. And as you see, A would represent this quadrant here. B, order transformation, would be those economic concepts and principles that have exhibit strong tendencies towards order and transformation. C, this quadrant here, are those that have a strong tendency towards transformation and law. And then the D is the quadrant that where we would put economic principles and concepts that exhibit strong tendencies towards law and human spirit. So these are the quadrants of the divine economy model right here. And so I think what I want you to do now is spend a moment reflecting on that whole idea. I don't know if you've ever had that experience before where you could see how interconnected they were and how the concepts possibly could show certain tendencies which would give them placement in a model such as this. So you can reflect on that for a minute. So while you're finishing up on your reflection, we'll go back to the audio book and we'll take a look at the next section. And that is, now we're going to get into the quadrant itself. And so what we're looking at is the real world economic principles in the human spirit order quadrant. I have chosen 8 economic principles for placement in this quadrant. These are principles that exist in, emerge from, and complement both the human spirit and the social order. They find origin from human action, and yet they also inspire more human action. They find expression in the market, and are amplified in the market, and at the same time they continuously emanate knowledge via the market. See diagram 4b. So there they are. We're going to go now to the highlighted portion. So we have this section is called the real world economic principles in the human spirit order quadrant. And there's 8 economic principles that are in this quadrant because they exhibit characteristics of the human spirit and the social order. And so that can be seen in diagram 4b. 4b, the title of the diagram is Economic Principles in the Human Spirit Order Quadrant. So here's Human Spirit Order Quadrant, and these are the economic principles that are in that quadrant. Price theory, marginal utility, imperfect knowledge, profit and loss, economic calculation, prices of higher order goods, disutility of labor, and competitive theory. The first of these, now let me go back and show you that on this picture here. So we're now going to look at price theory. So here we are. This is part of that canopy in that quadrant, and we're going to start looking at price theory. With regards to price theory, a good starting point is the law of supply and demand. Whoops, I want to get back to that. Sorry about that. Okay. With regards to price theory, a good starting point is the law of supply and demand. Accordingly, if the supply of a good or service increases, then the price decreases. Likewise, if the demand for a good or service decreases, then the price decreases. Here's the highlights for that paragraph. So when we're talking about price theory, a good starting point is the law of supply and demand. And so that's what we talked about, that if the demand for a good or service decreases, then the price decreases. That's the concept. That's how it works. The next paragraph we're going to look at. The price of a good or service in the real world is relative. It is relative to other goods and services, and it is relative to the earlier price of that good or service itself, which means that the system can be described as a floating price system. In other words, all prices are relative at the time and place of human action in the market. It is exactly that fact, that prices are relative to all others, that enables the price system to play an economizing role in decision making. So we're going to look at the highlights then for that paragraph. The price of a good or service in the real world is relative. It's relative to other goods and services, and it's relative to the earlier price of that good or service itself, which means that the system can be described as a floating price system. All prices are relative at the time and place of human action in the market. And this enables the price system to play an economizing role in decision making. Let's assume that you go to a marketplace with $100 needing food and clothing and medicine, but you find that the market is in a dysfunctional state. There are no relative prices. Only one price, $45 for the clothing, is known at the time. Would you know how to prioritize, or whether to buy the clothing or not? A price system absent of relative prices strips the market process of its ability to function. So the highlight for that paragraph is simply this: a price system absent of relative prices strips the market process of its ability to function. And now we have come to the point where there is a need to define the market to offset the commonly held prejudices against the market. The market is universal. It is a process where knowledge flows freely. The market is benevolent, and its process is profoundly cooperative and quietly consultative in nature. There is a need to define the market to offset the commonly held prejudices against the market. The market is universal. It's a process whereby knowledge flows freely. It's benevolent, and its process is profoundly cooperative and consultative in nature. The market is a conveyor of information, just as is language. The following analogy is useful. Individually, I can speak to myself alone, or I can more fully use language and speak with others. Undoubtedly, the full benefits of language as a human endowment come from its social nature. If I happen to speak vulgarly, language as a human institution should not be attacked as being harmful. In fact, the social nature of language empowers it to have a moderating and refining influence on individuals, thereby lessening the occurrence of vulgarity. The market, likewise, releases the full benefits of the human spirit and all of the associated resources. If someone acts in a crude or frivolous manner, it is not the fault of the market. In fact, it is the social nature of the market that will tend to moderate and refine individuals, ultimately facilitating the advancement of civilization. So we're going to look at the highlights for that paragraph. The market is a conveyor of information, just as is language. The full benefits of language come from its social nature. Likewise, the market releases the full benefits of the human spirit and all of the associated resources. If there's someone acts crude, it's not the fault of the market. In fact, the market is the social nature of the market, which will tend to moderate and refine individuals, facilitating the advancement of civilization. The price system finds expression in the market in the form of relative prices, which convey important information. For instance, factors which exhibit characteristics such as mobility or convertibility have a higher value than similar immobile or inconvertible factors. Here's another example. Nominal wage rates mean little, but real wage rates convey important information about wages, since it is then put in terms that are relative to other prices. So even if all prices are decreasing, but the wage rate is decreasing to a lesser degree, then the real wage rate is actually increasing. The market is the vehicle for conveyance of this valuable information, and people make decisions or choices based on it. Okay, so we're going to look at the highlights for that paragraph. The price system finds expression in the market in the form of relative prices, which convey important information. For instance, some factors are mobile and convertible. They have a higher value. Another example. It's real wage rates that convey important information about wages. And the reason it does that, because it puts things in terms that are relative to other prices. The market is the vehicle for conveyance of this type of valuable information, and people make decisions and choices based on it. Final paragraph in this section. Business individuals active in the market assess costs and revenues and continually modify their plans due to the signals that come as a result of changes in demand and supply. These adjustments that are made as prices are influenced by demand and supply, that are made as prices are influenced by demand and supply, demonstrate that the price system is both dynamic and efficient. So these are the highlights for that paragraph. So to be able to assess costs and revenues and modify plans, for those that are active in the market, they need signals, and those signals come as a result of changes in the demand and supply. And the fact that that happens demonstrates that the price system is both dynamic and efficient. So we're about to look at marginal utility. I want to show you where we are then. Okay, so here's the canopy. We've done price theory. We're now going to look at marginal utility. Closely allied to relative prices is the concept of marginal utility. The market conveys information about a plethora of relative prices of goods and services, but ultimately active decision-making by each person resides at the margin. The choice made is ultimately based on the subjective valuation about the perceived gain from the various choices. Whichever choice is perceived to bring the greatest satisfaction and fulfillment at the margin is chosen. Let us assume that I am very hungry and I can either buy a pencil or an apple for a quarter. I will readily recognize the greater marginal utility of the apple and buy it. So we're going to look at the paragraph here on marginal utility. Closely allied to relative prices is marginal utility. The market is what's conveying information, and that's what is what people use to make their active decision making, and that's done at the margin. And all the choices that are made at the margin are based on the subjective valuation about the perceived gain from the various choices. Those that are chosen because they bring the greatest satisfaction and fulfillment at the margin. So I'm going to greet you here in person after I drop my mouse here. And looking at that and seeing that the person chose the apple instead of the pencil kind of reminded me that I'm getting thirsty. So this is a moment here where I'm going to take a drink from my Ludwig von Mises Institute coffee mug. To quench my thirst. And then we'll go ahead and we'll get back to the audiobook. And we're about to move into the next principle, which is imperfect knowledge. So I'm going to show you where we are on this diagram here, this picture here. So we've done price theory, we've done marginal utility. Now we're about to go into imperfect knowledge. Imperfect knowledge. This is an insurmountable and inescapable reality. As imperfect knowledge is moderated by having some knowledge and having some certainty, people make decisions and act. So we'll look at the highlights for that. We're in this section of imperfect knowledge, and it's an inescapable and insurmountable reality, but it is moderated by having some knowledge and some certainty, and that's what enables people to make decisions and act. Part of the uncertainty comes from a lack of information, and the corollary to this is the uncertainty about the other human beings on the planet and their subjective decisions and their actions. The relatively free and immediate flow of knowledge that is the potential of the market ameliorates this condition. Another part of the uncertainty comes from the time element, that is, the great unknown we call the future. The only certainties are that there are uncertainties, that the world is dynamic, and that the market works best when it is unhampered. So we'll look at the highlights for that paragraph. So the uncertainty that's out there comes from a lack of information. And part of that is that we're uncertain about the other human beings on the planet, their subjective decisions and their actions. The relatively free and immediate flow of knowledge that's the potential of the market ameliorates this condition. So that is the magnificent thing to keep in mind, that the potential of the market is to allow relatively free and immediate flow of knowledge. And when that happens, it ameliorates this condition of imperfect knowledge. Another part of the uncertainty is the time element, this great unknown we call the future. There are a few certainties. One is that there are uncertainties, and another is that the world is dynamic, and the other, which you'll find out if you don't already know from the divine economy theory, is that the market works best when it is unhampered. So we're about to go into the next section, but before we'll do, we'll check where we are. So we're now going to go into profit and loss. We've done these three, and now we're going to go into profit and loss. Concomitantly, there is no certainty, and therefore there is no guarantee that any effort made by a producer interacting in the market will yield a profit. It is a simple fact that all exchanges that take place during the market process occur because of a double inequality of values. Will an exchange take place? Exchange occurs only when both parties value what they receive higher than what they give. We'll look at the highlights. For profit and loss. There is no certainty, and so there's no guarantee that a producer interacting in the market will yield a profit. We do know that all exchanges that take place during the market process occur because of a double inequality of values. Will an exchange take place? It will if there's a double inequality of values. Involvement as an entrepreneur has risk because of uncertainty. The nature of the active entrepreneur is to be alert to opportunities. That is to say, to needs not being met or not being met as well as they could be. In the market, it is possible that my perception as an entrepreneur is right, or maybe it is wrong. It is possible that my perception of the resources that I happen to think are needed may combine and serve the consumer's wants better, or perhaps not. So what we have here to highlight for this paragraph is that there's risk, and it's because of uncertainty. So the entrepreneur faces that risk. They're alert to opportunities, and those opportunities like needs that aren't being met or needs that aren't being met as well as they could be. But just because as an entrepreneur I perceive something in the market, there's no guarantee. It could be right, maybe it's wrong. Maybe the combination or the perception of resources that the entrepreneur thinks are needed to combine better to serve the consumers, maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. What's going on here? So this is part of the constant ebb and flow that necessarily results from the uncertainty in the real world. The market encompasses all the various facets of the economy, such as profit and loss, entrepreneurship, communication, and knowledge. And the market conveys information in terms of relative prices. So there's this constant ebb and flow that's just a result of uncertainty in the real world. The market encompasses all the various facets of the economy, and the market conveys information in terms of relative prices. In its earliest appearance in the primitive economy, profit or loss was simply the outcome. If I raided a bird's nest, I either found food or not. If my effort was not productive, my failed effort represented my loss. If my effort was productive, the food then profited me. The profit motive is a necessary and inherent feature of the human operating system. As humans evolved and as the economy evolved, profits enabled producers to provide wages and other factor incomes and to be one of the sources of the capital that encourages endeavors with lengthier production times. So the highlights for this paragraph is that the profit motive is a necessary and inherent feature of the human operating system. As humans evolved and as the economy evolved, profits provide wages and other factor incomes and is the source of capital. And that encourages endeavors with lengthier production times. So we're about to go into the next section, and before we do, we'll go over to see where that fits. Actually, what we're going to do now is going to have a moment's reflection. So if you'll think about those principles and how they're related to each other, how they're related to the human spirit and the order in the economy, I'd appreciate that if you did that. Okay. Okay, so there's somebody who's come to the Facebook Live and left a comment. It was Harris, and he asked that this video be left on the page, and I will do that. And also I'll be transferring it over to the YouTube channel at some point. So thank you for your encouragement, Harris. While you're reflecting, I'll get ready to start the next section. So we're going to go to economic calculation, but before we do, we'll look at it in the context of the canopy. So we've done these four, and we're going to next do these next four, and we'll start with economic calculation. Implied in the word calculation is a basis of knowledge. It is then from this basis of knowledge that the next step, that of calculation, can proceed. Implied in the word economic is information about the economy, which ultimately then is disseminated via the market. So here we are. We're starting a new section called economic calculation. Implied in the calculation word, calculation, is this basis of knowledge. The next step of that calculation can then proceed once you have that basis of knowledge. Implied in the word economic is the information about the economy, and that information is disseminated via the market. But first things first. It just so happens It just so happens that private property is an even more preliminary part of the market than the actual diffusion of knowledge. Values, of course, are necessary for calculation. Material and ideal things are valued and are therefore sought after to be owned. This value is the basis of knowledge for calculation. Look at the highlights. Private property is an even more preliminary part of the market than the actual diffusion of knowledge. Material and ideal things are valued and therefore are sought to be owned. And that's then the basis for calculation. The economy is dynamic and composed of many trillions of needs and decisions that often change complexion. The basis of knowledge needed for economic calculation comes from the market in the form of relative prices. These prices are relative to all other prices at the current moment. So the economy is composed of trillions of relative prices. Well, trillions of needs and decisions that often change complexion. And that then it forms this basis of knowledge that comes from the market in the form of relative prices. The freer the market is, the quicker the freer the market is, the quicker the information can flow, and the greater the ability is for it to correct errors. Desires, needs, and resources converge in the market and find full expression in the form of relative prices. Economic calculation involves comparing and contrasting and speculating about the relative prices expressed through the market. The freer the market is, the quicker the information can flow. All this information converges in the market and finds full expression in the form of relative prices. Economic calculation involves comparing and contrasting and speculating about the relative prices that are expressed through the market. Any attempt to calculate economically using fictional non-market values, values arbitrarily assigned by someone removed from the market, ignores the dynamic nature of the knowledge within the market, which is tantamount to denying the human spirit. Use of non-market values is the reason why vertical production in an excessively large firm results in bureaucracy and calculation error, for instance. So, what we have here is, if someone uses non-market, basically fictional values, it ignores the dynamic nature of knowledge in the market, and it's tantamount to denying the human spirit. Think about that. This is also the reason why socialism fails, since it is an error-based institution. What is meant by error-based is the fact that the prices used for decision-making are arbitrary and imagined, not derived from the market process. These prices are erroneous, and all decisions based on them are error-based. So the highlights for that paragraph. This is also the reason why socialism fails, since it's an error-based institution. In that kind of system, prices that are used for decision making are arbitrary and imagined, and these prices are erroneous, and all decisions based on them are error-based. We're going to now move to the next section, so I'll show you where that fits in on the picture here. So we've done economic calculation. Now we're going to look at prices of higher orders goods. Not only does the market enable economic calculation, but it extends beyond the here and now. The information in the market, the relative prices, also takes into account time. Goods which will reach the market in the future have a present value. And since they have value, so too, all of the resources needed in their production have value. In other words, factor prices are relative prices. So we're moving into the next section in this part of the chapter, the first part of chapter 4, and this section is called Prices of Higher Order Goods. And one of the wonders of the market is it gives us the ability to calculate economically beyond the here and now, because the information in the market, the relative prices, takes into account time. What that basically means that goods that appear in the market in the future have a present value. And since they have value, so too all the resources needed in their production have value. In other words, factor prices are also relative prices. However, without private property in factors of production, there can be no realistic factor prices. And without factor prices, cost accounting is impossible. To repeat, private property ownership is vital to the market. The economic calculation needed to realize profits, which pay the wages and factor incomes, depend on it. As decisions are made in the market between consumer goods and higher order goods, a bridge forms between the present and the future. This bridging of the present and the future in the form of capital structure potentially leads to economic development. We'll look at the highlights for that paragraph. Without factor prices, cost accounting is impossible. Private property ownership is vital to the market. Profits pay the wages and factors incomes. And there's a bridge that forms between the present and the future. And that bridge takes the form of capital structure. And that's what potentially leads to economic development. We're about to go into the next section. But before we do, we'll see where that lies in this canopy. So we just looked at prices of higher order goods. We're going to look at the disutility of labor. Exchange in the marketplace, market process, only happens if parties feel that there is a gain. When an individual wishes to sell his services in the market, he or she checks to see what the relative prices, wages for example, what the relative prices are, and then he must decide if the income is worth more than the alternatives, including leisure. What I mean by leisure is whatever you would do instead of work if that was a choice that you could afford. We're going to look now at the highlights. Exchange takes place only if both parties feel that there is a gain. So, if someone goes into the market to work, maybe to gain income, they have to make a choice, and they'll decide if the income is worth more than the alternatives, which includes leisure. And by leisure is meant whatever you would do instead of work, if you could afford to do that. Make that choice. However, if leisure is subsidized in any way, then less of the labor factor becomes available, which reduces the productive capacity of the economy and sends waves throughout the economy like ripples emanating from a pebble dropped in a pond. If leisure is subsidized, then relative prices throughout the economy will change, leading to a cascading of aberrant decisions. Such is the plight and blight of the welfare economy. If leisure is subsidized, it reduces the productive capacity of the economy. All relative prices throughout the economy will change, and that will lead to a cascading of aberrant decisions, and that's the plight and blight of the welfare economy. There is nothing wrong with disutility of labor, determining whether there is an exchange in the market, as long as it is a true expression, rather than one distorted by subsidies. There is nothing wrong with the disutility of labor. In fact, the disutility of labor is actually a motive force. It inspires alertness to choices and alternatives. Indeed, disutility of labor underlies entrepreneurship, and it also underlies capital. Disutility of labor determines whether there's an exchange in the market. Disutility of labor is actually a motive force. It inspires alertness to choices and alternatives. It underlies entrepreneurship, and it underlies capital. We're now going to look at the next section, which is competitive theory. Where are we here? And that we'll look at here. So here's the canopy that we're looking at, and we just did disutility of labor. We're now going to look at competitive theory. Oops, what are we doing here? The natural tendency for humans is to make progress. That is what is implied in the act of exchange, since exchange only takes place when both parties perceive a gain. This searching and questing and striving is part of the human operating system. That is not to say that there is not disorder in the economy, just like the example given about the disorder resulting from subsidizing leisure. This section is called competitive theory. the natural tendency is for humans to make progress. There's a searching and a questing and striving that's part of the human operating system. It's inherently part of humans. Making decisions at the margin based on the relativities and comparing where you are with where you want to be is natural, and it is a human quality. Striving for excellence and refining oneself and one's circumstances are meritorious expressions of this human trait. The knowledge that flows from the market process provides the individual with data in the form of relativities. Judgment about what is available, what possibilities exist, and about one's current condition hinge on information available in the market. Okay, decisions are made at the margin based on relativities. There's this comparison being made where you are and where you want to be, striving for excellence and refining oneself. And all of that is connected to the knowledge that flows from the market process. And that's you could call it data, in the form of relativities. It's not empirical, though. It's data, but it's not empirical. And so there's a judgment that takes place, and that judgment is about what's available, what's one's current conditions, and that's hinges on the information that's available in the market. So now we're going to actually address this idea. Competition in the market is not a negative like it is in the animal world, where survival of the fittest is the outcome. The economy is divinely at the service of mankind. Competition in the market among producers leads to new and better goods and services and better means of production. With this advancing prosperity, there are no long-run losers. Competition in the market is not a negative. The economy is divinely at the service of mankind. And this competition leads to new and better goods and services and better means of production. There's no long-run losers. Currently, the corruption of the divine economy by ego-driven manipulators directs wealth towards favored ones and away from others. This human intervention hampers the divine economy and is what causes the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. In contrast to the hampered economy created by the interventionists, the net efficiencies that come from competition in a free market benefit everyone. So it's this intervention by the ego-driven manipulators that causes the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. In contrast to that, the net efficiencies that come from competition in the free market benefit everyone.
That's Leah. That's Leah. Oh my God. I can't believe it. I can't believe you're not taking that.
Okay, so we are about to go into the next section, and that is about That is about this part here, which is, it's not actually not listed on here. I got distracted here. I apologize. So, where are we here? We're about to go into this next section, which is called the Human Spirit Order Quadrant Example, Disutility of Labor. At a basic level, each human being can distinguish between the ease or difficulty of the life task ahead. If a person is given the choice, that person will always prefer the easier of the two means of attaining their ends, as long as the task is not a recreational challenge or a personal development goal. What appears to be non-productive urge, choosing the easy way, is actually a positive force. Leah, can I call you back later, please? Thank you. I'll call you back. I'm right in the middle of a Facebook Live, so. Thank you. Bye. Okay, I'm back, sort of. I had a phone call, and so anyway. Where we are is we're going to look at one. We picked out one of those economic principles that were in that quadrant, and the one that we picked was the disutility of labor. And so, at the basic level, each human being can distinguish between the ease or difficulty of the life task ahead. If a person is given the choice, that person will always prefer the easiest of the two means of attaining their ends, as long as the task is not a recreational challenge or a personal development goal. What appears to be a non-productive urge, choosing the easiest way, is actually a positive force. Disutility of labor is a sign of intelligence. It is a motivating force that leads to innovation. It inevitably causes advancement and progress. Oh, shoot. Okay, so we are looking at this one economic principle, disutility of labor. And we're going to look at it closely, and so we'll begin here. It says humans can distinguish between what's easy and difficult. If a person is given the choice, that person will always prefer the easier of the two means of attaining their ends. What happens to be a non-productive urge, what appears to be a non-productive urge, choosing the easy way, is actually a positive force. It's a sign of intelligence. It's a motivating force that leads to innovation. And it inevitably causes advancement and progress. So, disutility of labor, despite being an underlying law of purposeful action, has been corrupted and turned into a negative characteristic in the economy under the current system of intervention. For instance, why work when your basic needs are met if you don't work? Or why provide excellent service when you get paid the same either way? Plus, you cannot lose your job. These distortions caused by interventions pervert the inherent power of this economic law that is an inherent part of purposeful human action. So it's an underlying law of purposeful human action. Disutility of labor is an underlying law of purposeful action. But in a world of interventionism, it's turned into a negative characteristic. So why work if your needs are met when you don't work? Why provide excellent service if you can't lose your job even if you don't do a good job, provide excellent service? And it's these distortions that are caused by intervention, and they pervert this inherent power, the inherent power of this economic law, which if left alone would lead to advancement and progress. So we're now going to continue to look at that economic principle of disutility of labor, but we're actually going to see it using a production possibility frontier. So that's what this section is called. It's human spirit order quadrant, production possibility frontier example. Developing production possibility frontiers for each economic principle has never been done before. It requires contemplation and identification of the active principle and its antithesis. Let me take you through the thought process. A good place to start is to identify the meaning of the no-growth point. In this example, disutility of labor, the no-growth economy occurs when, in a relative sense, the aggregate satisfaction resulting from compensation for not being productive equals the satisfaction resulting from compensation for being productive. See diagram 4C. There's diagram 4C called the disutility of labor production possibilities frontier. So developing production possibilities frontiers for each economic principle has never been done before. And what it requires is identification of the active principle and its antithesis. So what we want to do for disutility of labor is find the no-growth economy, which is when aggregate satisfaction for being non-productive equals the aggregate satisfaction for being productive. And you look at diagram 4C to see that. So we have disutility of labor production possibilities frontier. Here's the no-growth point, and that's relative to these two aggregates. Compensated for productivity, compensated even if not productive. If in aggregate the lack of productivity is rewarded, the economy will contract, as shown in 4D. This is why welfare economics is counterproductive. So we'll look at that. Paragraph. If in aggregate the lack of productivity is rewarded, the economy will contract. And this is why welfare economics is counterproductive. So you can see that in diagram 4D. Here's the disutility of labor contracting economy. So what we have here is it's north and west of the no-growth point. It's towards the compensated if not, even if unproductive. So I would rather not work. And over time then, what happens is the economy contracts. Pretty much a common sense understanding of what would happen. But now it's a visual economic diagram. For those who say that welfare economics is compassionate, the end result is far from compassionate. A contracting economy, which inevitably results from this type of economic intervention, offers less goods and services, less employment, and lower standards of living, All of this translates into increased human suffering. So do not believe the so-called compassionate, ego-driven interventionists. Again, see diagram 4D. Okay, so here are the summaries. The end result is far from compassionate. Welfare economics, some claim that's compassionate. It's far from compassionate, because the outcome of this contracting economy, it offers less goods and services, less employment, and lower standards of living. And that all translates into increased human suffering. See diagram 4D, and we already looked at that we have this contracting economy as a result of the distortion of the disutility of labor by interventionism. Whereas this principle of the human spirit order quadrant, the disutility of labor, as it occurs naturally in the divine economy, is an example of finding better ways to do things. Diagram 4E. Notably, it is where being productive is preferred over the tediousness of unproductive methods and habits. So, in contrast, this disutility of labor as it occurs naturally in the divine economy leads to finding better ways to do things. It is where being productive is preferred over the tediousness of unproductive methods and habits. So what happens in this, in diagram 4E, which is this disutility of labor expanding economy, you have the disutility of labor expressed as, I would rather be productive, finding ways, better ways to do things, and as a result, over time, you get an expanding economy. So we're now at the point where we're on the last section in this portion, in this part of chapter 4, and we'll look at the summary of the human spirit order quadrant. So here is a summary. The market is a time and place where information about relative prices is discovered. It is also a process within which knowledge flows. Not all knowledge is expressed as a price, but all knowledge is relative, and it is the market where such knowledge is accessible to humans. So we're going to look at the summary of the human spirit order quadrant. The market is a time and place where relative prices are discovered. It's also a process within which knowledge flows. And all knowledge is relative. And the market is where such knowledge is accessible to humans. The market can be described as unplanned order. It is economic action in the market that creates wealth. For the sake of human enlightenment and for the sake of prosperity, the market needs to be unhampered. Human intervention in the market is inevitably a corruption and a disruption of the divine economy. So, one way of describing the market is unplanned order. It's economic action in the market that creates wealth. And the market, for that to all take place, for the enlightenment and for the enrichment of to bringing about human prosperity, the market needs to be unhampered. Human intervention in the market inevitably causes corruption and disruption. So that's where we are, and I'm going to see if you want to spend a moment reflecting on what we've looked at, and I'm going to check to see if anyone's come to the Facebook Live. We've just had the one visitor, so that's okay. Appreciate you coming, Harris. And so we're going to go back to finish this. We'll go and we'll look at the selected exercises. So the selected exercises for this part of chapter 4 is, you would, I think I'll just look at it and the highlighted part. If you were going to use this as a textbook, then at this point you would, as part of your reflection, as part of your exercise, you would find and describe a real-world example for one of the specific principles that's in that quadrant. Okay, that's what you do. You'd find one. And then, after you did that, you'd develop a series of production possibility graphs. First you'd find the no growth point, and then you'd look at the contracting and expanding economies by identifying the aggregates for each axis. And then you would describe, and that would be what you would do as part of describing the axis. You'd label it with those opposing aggregates, and then you would see how that affects the economy, whether it's in a contracting or an expanding economy, and just go ahead and describe how the economy is affected if that principle is understood or it's misunderstood. So that's pretty much how we would proceed with that. And now I'm going to visit with you. What in the world? Oh, my background fell down. Bummer. That is a bummer. That happened. Okay. We're back in the waterfall. Okay, so anyways, I'm, again, very thirsty. I'm going to take a drink from my Ludwig von Mises Institute coffee mug. I apologize for any of the mishaps that happened there and the interruptions. And I'm just here live, so I can't help that. I hope you're doing well. I hope you enjoyed this. This is, like I said, part 1 of this chapter 4, Real World Economic Principles. We'll look at the other 3 quadrants in the next 3 episodes. And so I'm just wishing you the best, and I'm going to go ahead and sign out for this, and I hope that all is well, and we'll see you next time.